What's up, guys? Welcome back to the LTL Podcast. I am here with Steve,
Hello.
as always, and this week's episode is going to be a focused episode. It's going to be a little different than the kind of content you guys are kind of used to. I'm sure you could tell by the title if you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this on a streaming service that this is going to be about. We're going to talk about the hockey world's response to the conflict in Ukraine. Now, I do want to preface this by saying we're going to try to focus mostly on, the hockey world's response and the impact on hockey, because this is obviously a hockey podcast. We're not going to get really into like the minutia and like the nitty gritty of geopolitics, because that's not what this podcast is about. Like, it's going to come up at times, I'm sure, just because it's obviously they go hand in hand. But this isn't going to be like a comprehensive look at like the geopolitics that like led to this, or like what's going on, or what we're going to mostly focus on the hockey world. But I mean, I know for a fact, I don't have to say I know for a fact that I speak for everyone that is a part of the podcast team. Myself, Steve, and Tim, really kind of like the main three reoccurring people, and anyone that's really been on the podcast at any point, that we undeniably and unequivocally stand against the Russian aggression. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it with any of us. We are all very much in agreement that the war is unjustified. It is, quite frankly, ridiculous and needs to cease and end immediately. And Russia, as a government and as a military, is entirely and unequivocally in the wrong in this conflict. Period. Full stop. So I also just want to say that if you happen to be of Russian descent, or you are Russian and you're listening, this is not an indictment on you as a person, unless, with the caveat, unless you continue to and actively do support either the war effort or
Your warmongering president.
or Vladimir Putin himself. If you do support either one of those things, then yes, this is very much an indictment on you as a human being and as a person, and you should very much take a hard look in the mirror. But this is not an indictment on Russian citizens otherwise, Russian culture, or the country necessarily. It's mostly an indictment on the government, the politics, the people that are involved in it directly. So just also want to kind of throw
Um,
that out there.
I also think it goes without saying that we obviously stand with the people of Ukraine and stand in solidarity in their face of adversity and, like you said, an unjustified, unwanted war. I'm sure we could provide, if anybody's so inclined, like a list of some charities in the description if somebody feels like they want to donate to the cause or something. Um, because that's really all we can do here on this side of the pond, right, as Americans. Unless you're like dedicated enough to go volunteer and fight, but like that's we're not going to advocate you joining volunteer battalions. But if you do have some extra money, I know times are tough, especially with gas prices and everything going up, with all the economic war, like all the economic stuff going on based on this conflict. But if you do have a couple extra bucks, I'm sure we could find, because there are plenty of aid organizations working with the Ukraine, making sure they get medical supplies and civilians stay safe. So yeah, I guess that's really just that on that, right? Like in terms of like the geopolitics side of it.
Yeah, I'll certainly put some links in the description for anyone that wants to help out in that way. And like I said, we're going to try to mostly stick to what's going on in hockey, although some geopolitics will come up. Specifically, some economics will probably come up with a lot of the impact that this has had. But yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said wholeheartedly. Obviously, we stand with people of Ukraine, and we hope for a swift and peaceful end to this conflict that is completely unnecessary. Period. So, um, yeah. So the hockey world, obviously, much like every other institution across the globe, has had a very swift and, I would say, almost unprecedentedly strong response to this conflict, because we've seen you know, specifically in our lifetime, you know, when the first kind of conflict between Russia and Ukraine happened, when Russia illegally annexed part of the Crimea region, we didn't really see the kind of swift and severe response that we're seeing now. And I'm just going to run through a quick list of the responses of the hockey world, and then we can kind of delve into each one individually and kind of talk about that. But for starters, the harshest, I would argue, response came from the IIHF, the International Ice Hockey Federation, who completely banned the countries of Russia and Belarus. They have been thrown out of the IIHF, meaning if they ever want to take part in IIHF events again, they will have to reapply for admission into the International Ice Hockey Federation. So that includes Olympics. It includes any kind of non-NHL run World Cup.
World Juniors.
Yeah, World Juniors. Anything that the IIHF runs, Russia and Belarus are no longer allowed to take part. Obviously, if you're not really in the know, don't really need to explain why Russia's being thrown out. Belarus has shown unprecedented support for Russia and its president, and is probably most likely, from what we're hearing, planning their own invasion of Ukraine, which is why they're also being punished. The CHL has announced today that the Canada-Russia series has been canceled. We heard rumors. It's not confirmed, I don't think, yet, because the CHL's official Twitter account hasn't posted it. But we heard rumors that the CHL is going to ban Russian and Belarusian players from their import draft. Again, that is unconfirmed. It was tweeted out by an agent. He said that the CHL would announce its decision at 3 p.m. They haven't officially announced that yet, from what I can see to this point. So that's another possibility. The NHL has announced that they are suspending their relationship with business partners in Russia. They are pausing their Russian language social and digital media sites. They are discontinuing any consideration of Russia as a location for any future competitions involving the National Hockey League. I think you said it was CCM has announced that they are no longer sponsoring Russian hockey players.
I think what's important about that is, it's not just Russian athletes in Russia, it's Russian athletes, period. So guys who had pre-existing CCM endorsements have all had them pulled.
Correct. Yeah, so that impacts guys that are overseas here as well. And EA Sports has announced that the NHL 22, the Russian and Belarusian teams will be removed from the game completely. So obviously the hockey world has not taken too kindly to this. We saw... Well, actually, I want to save the point about the interviews later.
I was going to say, you want to start with like the least and work our way up to the top, and then we can start talking about players' responses and stuff.
So we'll start with what's probably the least impactful but still important, which is obviously the removal of the teams from NHL 22.
Yeah.
And I think what's important to know about this is you can say what you want about this move. You can say that it's performative politics, and I certainly do think to a large extent it is, because let's be honest here. If they didn't do this, nobody really would have called them out on it. People might have said, well, hey, why are they still in the game? Because they're not part of the IAHF. It's unrealistic, quote unquote. But I don't think anybody really would have gotten on EA's case. But I do think it's important that they did this as a show of like, look, this is all we can do as a video game company, but we're going to do it,
Yeah, I also think there's something to be said for them wanting to remove the iconography from the game. And because, let's be honest, like the NHL community, not like the NHL as an organization, but the NHL is like the EA Sports NHL community, is notoriously toxic, right? We've seen, year after year, they have to keep addressing like racial, or any sort of like prejudiced club names, player names, stereotypes, things like that happen in ESHL, which is probably primarily where this is being directed, because you can use their jerseys and stuff. I've seen it already playing in the last week. There have been teams called like, with the Russian flag, and like the whole thing is called like the Ukraine Stompers and stuff like that. And it's like, I think it's more to do with that than it is with like anything else. Sure, it's performative, but again, what the hell is EA Sports going to do about a war halfway around the world? Like this is all that they have in their power to do. So I agree with your original point where it is something to be said, like it is all they can do, but I think there's a little bit more to it than just them thinking, oh, this is all we can do, right? You know?
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting. Um, it's going to be an interesting decision for them, looking ahead into the future for next year, whether or not they include any kind of Russian teams. I imagine that'll largely have to do with whether or not they're allowed back into the IIHF or not. I'm sure that that's probably the easiest thing for EA Sports to do, is to not wade into this any further than they have and just say, hey, look, if they're in the IHF, we have to put them in the game, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, it's relatively low impact, but again, I think the important part to note about this is, since this is all they can do, I'm happy that they did it, because they said,
Maybe
look,
they did
like,
anything, right?
exactly, like they could have very well just been like, look, we're a video game company, we can't do anything about this, this is way above our heads, we're just going to let it sit. But they were like, look, we don't agree with this, so we're going to do what we can do, and if removing them from the game means that we did something, then that's good enough for us.
And I mean, and this is one of those situations where I think like as a like an entity, EA doesn't want to be seen as like tacitly approving, because in situations like this, when you don't actively condemn something and you just kind of like pretend it doesn't exist, you're almost enabling it by its own, like a whole other argument, right? You can be enabling it that way. So I think EA was just trying to get out in front of it, right? Like, okay, well, nobody can say that we didn't do anything, one, because we did this, and two, they can't say that we're enabling them by like not doing anything at all and pretending that like this doesn't affect us, because it does. It affects everybody.
Right. So good for EA. I don't think that much more needs to be said about that, other than for once we can actually sit here and say EA did a good job.
They actually did something.
um, I want to talk. We'll save the throwing out of the teams from IHF for last,
Yeah, it's
because
the
I think that's
biggest
the most
one.
impactful. We'll go on to the NHL's response here. Um, Suspending their business relationships with partners in Russia, pausing Russian language social and digital media sites, and discontinuing any consideration of Russia as a location for any future competitions involving the NHL. Um,
I don't think these are really like.
I will say, I don't really think the NHL had any serious consideration of ever involving Russia as a location for anything. If they ever do the World Cup of Hockey again, I have to imagine it's probably going to stay in North America more than likely. Specifically be just for the logistics of it, if nothing else. Like at this point, why would we send all of our players over to like Finland to go play in an NHL style tournament? When we could just host it in like Montreal or something.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I think it's more because the NHL has been building towards like the NHL has been trying to build a really nice like a unique relationship with the KHL, right, where they're not in competition with one another anymore. And I think this is really more signaling that like the NHL isn't going to work towards, which I don't know if it was a stated goal of theirs or just something that I've always assumed they were working towards, which was, exhibition games played between KHL and NHL teams in Russia, kind of like the way they used to do with the SHL teams and the Finnish elite teams in like the preseason.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was more of like that was what that was building towards, and I think this is the NHL is saying like, listen, like that's not happening anymore. Like we are not. I mean, it's obviously what they're saying. Like they cut off their business ties, but so I just think, I mean, it's kind of a shame, right? Like the hockey world is now feels smaller because we're excluding arguably the third largest talent pool in the world, in the like in the entire hockey world. But it has to be done. Like they had no other options.
Yeah, and again, not to reiterate on something we kind of already said, but we do genuinely feel for the citizens of Russia and Russian hockey players who, don't support the war. They don't support Putin. They don't support the government's horrible actions, even outside of the war, with like political suffocation and stuff like that. Um, Obviously, look, we're not indicting Russian hockey players who have nothing to do with this, uh, but this is what has to happen. Unfortunately, like the Russian people who are now going to be paying 200% more for a loaf of bread. It sucks, and we really feel bad for those people, but it's the reality of the world, right? So like,
Yeah, and it's unfortunate they've been turned into a pariah, like a collective, the Russian people collectively become this pariah for a strong man. But uh, I mean, again, like, what is the NHL really going to do? Like, what else? What other options do they
Right.
have other than to pull the purse strings, right? Like,
Which is
again,
where you have to hit people. You have to hit them in
yeah,
the
of
wallet.
course. And I mean, and again, like, I think all these organizations have been very smart, not smart, but very careful in the way they've worded these and walked this out. Like you said, the rumors so far are circulating that they're going to ban Russian and Belarusian athletes from the import draft. But uh, I'm glad that it hasn't gotten to that extreme so far. Like all of these steps have been mostly monetary or financial in nature. It hasn't been targeting like people or specific players or players from a region specifically. Um, so I think like that's been really important so far. Like nobody's demonizing Russia, like the Russians, right? Like it's the president everyone has a problem with.
And the government who supports
Right.
him. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I know we've said it before, and we're probably going to say it again for the end of the episode, but like that, this is a line that like we want to make very clear to the people listening that like we aren't putting you all down. Like this isn't a collective us saying no, the Russians are bad. You know, we're smart enough to realize like that there's three dimensions to everything that's happening here, and like
Yeah. Sorry, finish your thought. I didn't
no,
mean to cut you off.
no, I was gonna say that's really it. Just like we're smart enough to realize that there's three dimensions here, and that like realistically only one part of that like cube that is like the Russians is pulling the strings right now.
Yeah, the only people that we genuinely feel any sort of negative emotion for is the president, the government, and any people that are willingly supporting, propagating, or in any way showing support for the war in Ukraine or the president, right? Like those are the people that we have issue with. Those are the people that we think need to be punished. Just your random, average, everyday Russian citizen who really doesn't like Vladimir Putin, but they know they can't say anything because he'll threaten their family's life. That's not the
Yeah.
people that we're targeting here. It unfortunately, as a result of all these kind of sanctions, those are the people that are gonna kind of catch the bullet, so to speak, to use an apt phrase in wartime. But you know, like I said, the old Russian lady from Siberia who now has to pay 400 extra rubles for her loaf of bread, even though she had nothing to do with this. Unfortunately, that's the people that get hurt. But
So I just wanted to put that clarifier out there, just because for the rest of this podcast, we're probably gonna be pretty blunt.
negative.
Yeah, it's gonna be like not. I don't want to say negative because like it's not negative. It's just like we're gonna be very blunt about this, and like we're not gonna pull punches on it, right? Like essentially, at the end of the day, what the point we're trying to make is that like all of these moves, as extreme as they might sound, they're deserved. Like this is really at the end of the day, like this you reap what you sow, you know. So if you think we're being a little too harsh, then like sorry, but it's at the end of the day, it's the truth. So
And when we say, because we're going to talk about Russia as a general concept, when we say, oh, Russia deserved this, we're talking about like the government officials and the government and the economy of Russia, this nebulous thing, right? We're not talking about the people. So
you know, like Ivan and Boris, like
yeah, when we're going to use the phrase Russia a lot in terms of this podcast, just know that we're not talking about the people for the most part. So yeah, I mean, to your point with the NHL and the KHL, we'd actually heard rumors for a while that the KHL was going to be added to EA Sports' NHL because the NHL was going to work out some kind of licensing agreement. There was also rumors that maybe the NHL would work out some kind of streaming agreement with the KHL, where if you subscribe to the NHL TV package, maybe once a week you get to watch a KHL game. That was a rumor to be in the works. Obviously, at this point, all of that is completely off the table. And whatever other business partners the NHL has in Russia are also completely off the table. So the NHL is hitting them financially where it hurts. And I do want to make a point about this. Some people might sit here and say, oh, it's just sports. Who cares? This isn't doing anything. Sports, I don't have the numbers, and I'm not an economist. But from what I have read, sports do play a very significant role in the Russian economy. They make a lot of money off this kind of stuff, as do the United States and Canada. Obviously when when the COVID pandemic first hit, we were hearing all these numbers like America's losing X hundreds of millions of dollars because baseball's off and football's off and this, that, and the other thing, right? So like, obviously Russia still has the KHL going, but to kind of transition, players are leaving the KHL in droves at this point. Like many players, not just one or two, have left their KHL teams, completely abandoning their contracts and are going home. And in fact, Jokerit has completely abandoned the KHL. They left. They're done. They're not a KHL team anymore. They completely nullified and voided their entire contract and left the KHL.
And
So an
I mean,
entire team has just left the league.
I mean, for the so I guess I'll tackle this in two stages, right? The player thing, I mean, it makes sense, right? Especially considering that like every major world power just shut their airspace to Russian airplanes. Like and land crossings are all shut now. Like if you're a player in the KHL, it's either get out now or you're stuck in Russia until God knows when, right?
Yeah.
So for like a Western player, that's a big consideration to make, and also another consideration to make even for Russian players, is it really going to be worth playing when, your contract's value is going to be next to nothing, and
Oof, yeah.
you're not going to have the opportunity to, if you do well, graduate to, anywhere else in the world. Like, you're not going to have the freedom of mobility that, say, like a Swedish player has right now, where he can go play in Finland, Sweden, Norway, here, Canada, wherever, and that was an option for those guys up until 6 weeks ago, really. I mean, up until 7 days ago, these are all options for these players. So I can't blame these guys for fleeing, in droves. And the other thing is, with a team like Jokerit, I mean, I'm surprised more teams. I mean, obviously, most of the teams in the KHL are Russian based, but there are a few exceptions to. I think there's obviously was Jokerit, which is Finnish, and I'm pretty sure there's a Chinese team.
The Kunlun Red Star.
But so I'm surprised. I mean, I applaud Jokerit for making what honestly is probably a really harsh financial decision for themselves, because the the revenue stream they just cut themselves off from in the KHL is significantly larger than what they had in Liga. But I will always respect somebody for standing on principle instead of on their wallet. So again, I applaud Jokerit for making the right decision. I implore the Kunlun Red Star to do the same thing. I know that they're newly formed teams like native to the KHL, and I know like the geopolitics of the situation doesn't really lead to them having this kind of pressure because of China and Russia's relationship. That being said, I do think it's important, like, to do whatever you can. And in terms of somebody where these other Russian teams don't have a choice, I mean, they could go on strike, right? The KHL could say, we're not playing until this is over. Like, this is too much for us. And I implore them to explore those options too. I explore anybody who has any sort of power to make any sort of noise or any sort of difference in these positions to seriously, like, consider them, right? It doesn't have to be as drastic as Jokerit leaving the league, and it doesn't have to be as drastic as like players fleeing the league. But like, I don't know. I feel like the KHL, the owners have an obligation to do something, you know. And granted, I know a lot of them are oil barons who are oligarchs who are contributing to this mess. But I mean, you're not. There's no money in this for them either, right? Like, if their economy hits the shitter and like it's 150 rubles to $1, like, these contracts these guys are paying out are going to be absurd. It's going to be like 100 trillion ruble contract. You know, so just from like a business perspective, I don't understand why the KHL isn't wading into this a little bit more than they have. You know,
Yeah,
I mean, I get why, right? Like the political
because
repression and all
yeah,
those things. But at the same time, I feel like there's got to be something somebody can do. But again, to refocus us back on what we were originally talking about, I applaud Jokerit for making the call, and I hope that Liga allows them back into the league format and however they have to juggle it for the rest of the season. If not this season, then next season. But at the end of the day, I hope Jokerit can find a home in a league, and I'm sure they will. It's one of the oldest and most storied franchises in European hockey.
yeah. So their season's over because they were due to play in the playoffs. So the KHL season is over, essentially the regular season, and obviously Jokerit has abandoned the playoffs, and
They're
they're
forfeiting.
cutting
Yeah.
ties with the KHL. And ultimately, my point is that that's just another revenue stream that has now left Russian hockey, which obviously is going to impact the Russian government in the form of taxes, right? Uh, Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. You could say, oh, why does Joker leaving impact the Russian government at all? Well, because the KHL just lost an entire team's worth of revenue, which means that they're going to be paying less taxes next year, right? For when they report their taxes or whatever.
And also think of it in terms of legitimacy, right? Like this is the first you managed to convince one of the, like I said, most storied, oldest clubs in European hockey to come join your league, and then they just leave. Like it's a big blow to legitimacy, and I think like this is a team like teams or individuals will be leery of doing business with the KHL in the future. Not necessarily like in the long term future, but for over the next 5, 6 years, certainly because of stuff like this. So I don't think you're gonna see Jokerit go back to the KHL. Like it's not like this is gonna be this war ends and Jokerit's gonna be like, oh okay, and go right back, you know. So like there are implications for this, like you said, in tax revenue and also just in like the cultural perception of the league. I mean, especially now, again with the KHL being the NHL abandoning their ties to the KHL, it's another form of legitimacy lost, right? Because now the premier hockey league in the world wants nothing to do with you.
Right.
So
And the premier development league in the world, the CHL, doesn't want anything to do with you either because they just canceled the Canada Russia series, right?
right, which is a big deal because that's like, you know, that's one of the biggest events on that junior calendar every year. It's the Super Series and the World Juniors.
And like we said, the rumor is that the CHL is going to ban imports. They haven't announced that yet. Uh,
I think
and
that's kind of a slippery slope, to be honest with you. I don't know if we should be going that far yet.
yeah, the NHL, obviously they're not indicting any of their players. I do want to get to the all of this like long term implication, like kind of in its own bubble.
Yeah.
Um, so we'll wrap up with the last note that the like you said, the IHF has completely thrown out Russia and Belarus from the International Ice Hockey Federation. And again, that's another huge revenue stream. The Russian national team is not going to get any money ever from any Olympics, any international play, no World Cups, no Super Series or anything of that nature at all. And they're now unrecognized completely by the IHF. And, that's a pretty big deal considering that
Huge deal.
that means that they're going to have to reapply. And quite frankly, I have little faith that they will be allowed back in the IIHF so long as Vladimir Putin
Vladimir
remains in
Putin.
power.
Yeah. The other thing too, that this is, it's another legitimacy thing, right? Like it's almost so the Russians haven't been able to compete at the Olympics under their own flag in,
Four
I think it's been the
years?
last 3 or 4 like the last 2 or 3 Olympics.
I think it's the last two,
I
if
think
I
it's the
remember.
last.
Or
I think it's the last three because I'm pretty sure the last.
oh,
I
the
remember
last
it's
winter.
Sochi
Yeah. You're right. You're right.
because I remember what was it, the Russian Olympic Committee or whatever, the ROC team was competing or
It
whatever. But
was Russian. It was the Olympic
the
athletes from
athletes
Russia.
from Russia, that's it, the OAR. Um, so like at this point, it almost feels like it just feels like a legit, like a whole legitimate thing, right? Like it feels like the whole there's and at this point it's almost like getting reapplying for the IHF is gonna be such an uphill battle with that doping scandal under their nose, you know, and not being banned from the Olympics, and now, you know, everything else going on and having to prove to them that like, hey, we mean it this time, we changed, we want to be let back in, and it's gonna be hard to do, and it's a shame that we're not gonna be able to see guys like Alex Ovechkin or Nikita Kucherov go to the World Championship at the end of the year and compete like they do if they get eliminated from the playoffs. But them's the breaks, you know. It's it is what it is. Like it had to be done. The IHF had no other options, right? Like what other what this is a euphemism I keep saying to people to describe this like Ukraine thing in any context, which is there are no good options left. You know what I mean? Like the good options where we avoid this war and we don't have to have this conversation. But at the end of the day, that didn't happen. So now we have nothing but like cascading layers of shitty options, you know? And this being one of them. The fact that we had to completely like ban a group of people who had nothing to do with this decision, but who must bear the brunt because there's no other option in play here. Like, this is the only way to hit it, make it hurt for this guy.
Right. And the powerful thing that this does is, uh, besides, like I said, obviously the revenue situation, which is probably the most important, it just goes to show that this kind of thing is not just going to be glossed over. These violation of sovereign rights, of human rights, it's going to hurt no matter what you do. And if that's what it kind of takes to kind of show some people and shock some people and say, oh, I can't just support this warmongering lunatic, essentially,
this menace,
and just have my life be completely fine. Again, to the random third string goalie who didn't vote for Putin and has nothing to do with this, it sucks. But the IIHF can't sit here and continue to fund the Russian government. It just can't. The bottom line is allowing Russia to be a part of these events. They might as well just be fueling the war effort. You know what I'm saying? Like, you have to do something.
You have to do everything you can to make sure that your money isn't directly or indirectly ending up in the pockets of somebody as evil as Vladimir Putin, And at the end of the day, like, this is an unfortunate consequence of that.
Right. So let's talk about kind of the long-term and overall impact of these sorts of decisions on hockey, because this is going to have an impact. It already has, and will continue. I want to say something right off the bat, and some people, reporters were talking to Alex Ovechkin about this war, and people were like, why does Ovi have to answer for this? Why are we asking these questions? And the bottom line is, the reason that Ovechkin got picked out of the crowd to answer this is because he has been an outspoken and continued supporter of Vladimir Putin, despite all of the evidence against him, despite all of the evidence showing that he's a terrible person, and even post-Ukraine Crimea annexation has continued to vocally and publicly support Vladimir Putin. The argument that hockey players should just play hockey is bogus when you're as vocal as you are as Alex Ovechkin. If they started asking, like, Semyon Varlamov what he thinks, like, Varlamov has never, ever said anything about his politics, ever, period. He doesn't post it on his social media. He doesn't, go out of his way to make himself known as either a supporter or a detractor. If they ask, like, Panarin about it, it makes sense. He's a vocal detractor. You ask Ovechkin about it, he's a vocal supporter. When you're as public as you are with your support, yeah, when shit hits the fan, specifically because he was so supportive after the illegal annexation, that's when the question comes up, like, dude, you this happened like 2 years ago. What's good?
The other thing that I think is that people fail to recognize is that Alex Ovechkin is a torchbearer for the entire Russian hockey community. He's the biggest Russian name in the sport. Of course, when anything pertaining to his country of origin happens, he's going to be asked. Now, that being said, I do think it's unfair of certain media outlets to paint him in the light they've painted him recently. Specifically, and I'm going to call them out by name, is I think it's called Big Red Machine or whatever. That it's a Caps fan blog. And what bothers me is they've been a vocal supporter of Alex Ovechkin for his whole career. And in this one instance, they turned on him and threw him under the bus with a really disingenuous headline. They asked him what he thought, and Alex gave a really non-committal answer, right? Which I understand you want to throw him not throw him under the bus, but you really want to press him on that. You want to make it like, okay, well, no, you can't get away with that anymore. That being said, I also think it's not fair to paint him in a light of being like an evil, like a through and through Putin supporter right now, because like clearly Ovechkin has been conflicted about what's happening around him, and like you can see it on his face. That being said, I don't think it's unjustified for reporters to be asking these questions of him, because like you said, he has been a vocal Putin supporter in the past, and that again, like that's the breaks. Like you make the bed you sleep in, So like when you come out in support of this guy in the past, and there are pictures of you playing hockey with him and doing things with him and playing in tournaments sponsored by him, this is what happens. You have to answer for these kinds of things. And that being said, while I do just don't agree with the Big Red Machine or whatever their name is throwing him under the bus the way they did, I don't appreciate his answer either, because at the end of the day, like, all he essentially said was war is bad. It's like, okay, but that's nothing. Shit's at the fan, dude. People are dying, and you can't even come out and give like an actual answer about this. Like, that's really where my problem with this lies. You know what I mean? Like, I know you're conflicted. I know it's your country, and I know it's like your home, and you still have family that lives there. But when push comes to shove, like, you being the torchbearer for your community, it means something when you say anything, and the fact that you are ducking and dodging these questions isn't a good look.
And, not for nothing, Ovi's not the first guy to have to answer the bell on this.
No.
Specifically, I can think of one instance. If you remember, I believe it was somewhere in the first half of Donald Trump's presidency, Robin Leonard had Donald Trump portrait and insignia on his hockey mask, his goalie mask. And he was an outspoken Trump supporter. So, of course, around 2020, he got asked, what was good with your support of Donald Trump? He didn't shy away from it. He didn't back to a corner. He said, I supported Donald Trump. I've learned a lot of things about him since then. I no longer support him, and I don't give him any sort of accolades or support at all, which is the mature answer, Robin Leonard had to answer the bell for his politics because he was vocal about it. The guy was on his friggin' goalie mask. So, of course, he had to expect around election time that was going to come up. He handled it maturely. He handled it responsibly. Gave a succinct answer. Yes, I'm not shying away from that. I supported him. No, I currently do not support him. And in fact, I am ashamed that I supported him. And, say what you want. You could be like, oh, well, you're only pointing this out because his politics align with yours now and Ovechkin's doesn't. The bottom line at the end of the day is that Leonard gave a mature and vocal answer, whereas Ovechkin kind of slinked away. And think about this. Like you said, Ovechkin is the torchbearer and probably the most popular, I would actually not even say probably, he is the most popular Russian hockey player. But he's also incredibly popular just in general in Eastern Europe. And imagine being this, young, aspiring hockey player in Ukraine, and your idol is standing up on a podium mumbling and, like, I'm not gonna pull any punches here, bullshitting his way through answering this question. How does that make you feel?
How does it feel to essentially see your hero being complicit in the invasion and slaughter of your people? It's, again, I'm not asking for Alex Ovechkin to be up there giving me like a diatribe on like the politics of Russia and like the geopolitical reasons why this is wrong. I just want him to like unequivocally condemn the violence against the people that didn't ask for it from his government, from a guy that he's been supportive of in the past and has like been very public, like you said, with his support of. Like, you have to answer this question. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but eventually this question is going to keep getting asked, and eventually you're going to have to answer it. So you better either come up with an answer now, or what? Keep bullshitting us? Like, what's the point?
And you know what's really stupid about this too? Is the fact your non-answer is an answer. We know how you feel. You know what I'm saying? Like, yes, I agree with you that he definitely certainly looked conflicted, but the fact that you couldn't come out and make a succinct statement tells us that, A, you're conflicted, but also B, what some people might read into that is that he doesn't want to tell the truth. Some people are going to interpret your non-answer as, oh, he still supports Putin. He just knows that he can't say that without getting grilled. Whether or not that's true is another story, but that's the way a lot of people are going to interpret it. And quite frankly, in my, knowing what we know about Ovechkin and his complete lack of leadership skills, we've gone on rants about this before about how he's a terrible leader of the Washington Capitals. I would find that a pretty compelling argument. I'm not going to say I completely and unequivocally know that to be the truth, but you didn't give an answer, you bullshit your way through it, so that's an even worse look. You know what I'm saying? Like,
and you've managed to continue to avoid it. It's not like he made that non-committal answer and then the next day put out like a formal statement saying anything. He just hasn't said anything since then. And it's like, I mean, you have an obligation. whether you like it or not, you are the spokesman for Russian hockey players in North America. You are the face of Russian hockey for this generation and probably the next couple of generations. You're arguably the greatest goal scorer of all time. You have an obligation. You're a role model. You're a leader. People expect you to do and say the hard things. And listen, we've been critical of guys in the past, this year when their leadership skills kind of didn't align, not with our politics, but what the right thing was. I mean, we threw Jonathan Taves under the bus, not under the bus, but we threw him in front of the bus that he so rightfully tried to throw himself in front of. When he went to bat for
Yeah.
guys that covered up sexual abuse of one of his teammates. You know, we've questioned Ovechkin in the past for his on ice leadership. Screaming at his goaltender's face after losing a game for I don't know, whatever reason. But this is bigger than that. And like I said, you have an obligation. You're a role model. You're a superstar. You need to say something, whether or not it's something necessarily like substantive or if it's bullshit. You still have to say something. And you not saying anything, I mean, like you said, it is saying something because all it's doing is painting you in a more and more negative light. Because the longer you wait to say anything, the less people are going to believe it. I mean, we're a week into this invasion now, and he got asked on day one, and he still hasn't said anything since.
Yeah, and the ultimate issue is that like he was public with it. Right? Like, take a look at another random hockey player, like Anders Lee, right? I have no freaking clue what the guy's political alignment is. I don't know if he's Republican, conservative. The guy could be libertarian for all I know because he's kept that private. So if during the 2020 election they were like, "Hey Anders, what do you think about the election?" He said, "Look, guys, like I keep that to myself." That's a legitimate answer because he does. He's living that way. But if all of a sudden now Ovechkin's like, "Well, I want to keep my politics to myself," it's too late, bud. Like, it's too late to
Like,
do
you've
that.
already been photographed. Like, do you remember what
Your
was it?
profile picture on Instagram was you standing next to Vladimir Putin. That
Right, and
tells us all we need to know.
do you remember when he played in that tournament with him after, it was right after the Crimea thing. It was like in 2015. It was after the Sochi Olympics. They played in a tournament. I remember it was like the whole thing. Putin got like 6 goals or whatever because
Nobody
everybody's
touched
afraid to
him.
stop him.
Yeah.
It's like you've done all these things. When you won the Stanley Cup, you celebrated with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry, but like when you make a point of being associated with this guy and he goes and does something like this, you have to answer the bell. I don't care how conflicted you are or how you feel. And I know you have family that still lives there, and I know that you're afraid for them. But listen, at the end, the push comes to shove. Sometimes you have to do the right thing. I mean, look, Panarin did the right thing, and he had to take a leave of absence from the team. And I understand that there are real safety concerns with these players and their families. But you still have an obligation to do the right thing. I'm sorry, but you do. And I
And
know it's easy for me,
oh, sorry, good.
from my place of privilege here, who isn't in the line of fire, who doesn't have family living under the authoritarian boot of Vladimir Putin, to say you have an obligation to do the right thing. But it's the truth. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And what I will say, kind of on another point, is the NHL has made a point of saying that Russian players have been given extra security. They're kind of worried about their safety. I think as fans, we need to kind of take it upon ourselves to realize that this is not them for the most part, right? Like, if you want to boo Alex Ovechkin mercilessly every time he touches the puck, I think he well deserves that. But I just think in general, we need to realize that, like, look, we shouldn't be going as far as to like be making threats to the point where, and obviously the NHL isn't doing this in response to anything the fans have done, but you know, kind of preempting the situation where like let's not be throwing things at players. Don't try to like throw beer bottles at Russian players on their way out the tunnel. Don't bring race or their nationality into this. You know,
At the end of the day, we have to remind these Russian athletes that we're pushing them so hard to do the right thing because we respect them. You know what I mean?
right?
Like, we have to remind these guys that like they do mean a lot to the community and to the hockey world at large. I mean, the reason I'm giving Alex Ovechkin specifically such a hard time is because
He's
he
important.
is, yeah, he's the most important Russian player on the planet. Like, and so I just feel like for a guy that I had and still have a lot of respect for, obviously, like this isn't going to take away from how I feel about him on the ice, but it definitely does impact how I feel about Alex Ovechkin the person, you
Oh
know?
yeah, certainly. And I do want to talk about. Well, we'll kind of end the podcast on this topic. Something that is certainly not as impactful on a global scale. This is going to be a discussion about the impact of this on Russian hockey. So I do want to just note that everything we've talked about up until this point has been significantly more important than sports. Obviously, this goes well beyond sports. I understand that. So, yeah, I agree with everything you said, Steve. You're completely on point with that. 100%. So from here on, this is going to be less important talk, but it's something that is still in the same vein. And I want to ask, how is this going to impact how the NHL sees Russian players, how hockey in general sees Russian players? Because it almost kind of feels like there's another. It's not an iron curtain because for a
It
long
feels
time,
like
like
one.
Russian players couldn't come over and play at all. Period. Right. I would say it's not an iron curtain. I would say it's definitely like a matte black curtain at this point where we can't see through it because obviously NHL is not banning Russian players from playing, but the lack of visibility. Because I imagine that any NHL team with any scouts in the KHL has
Oh, they've
either
all left already.
have recalled them or have told them just stop working at this point.
Yeah,
The
I mean,
CHL game banning the Russian Canadian series, IHF banning Russian and Belarusian players. It kind of feels like for a lot of NHL teams, I would not be surprised to see a significant decrease in both the number of Russian players being drafted and their draft position for the next like couple of years. I just kind of want to get your thoughts on that.
yeah, I mean that's kind of how I see it, right? And it's gonna be its own like Russian factor, quote unquote, right? Because remember, in 20 years ago in the draft, it was the Russian factor. Like you draft these guys, and then like they may never come over.
Yeah.
So like teams are wary of drafting Russian players, and it feels like we finally broke that stigma where like you saw guys going in like the high draft picks, no matter where they were from. But the fact that Russian athletes have now been banned from coming over, they've been expelled from international competition where scouting is made more easy, and the fact that they're considering banning them outright from the import draft leads me to believe that the only way we're going to see Russian athletes come over as of right now, depending on how long this all goes on, is realistically going to be through like defection, like we used to. Like they're going to have to cut and run and come here like quote unquote illegally, the way Alex Mogilny and Peter Stastny had to do, you know?
Yeah.
And it's a shame. Like these guys shouldn't have to be putting themselves in that kind of at that kind of risk to come and play in the best hockey league in the world. But again, I know I keep saying it, but like that's them's the breaks. Like your president starts a war, an imperial war of conquest in Eastern Europe. Like these are the consequences you have to pay. And it's just a shame that like we had. I mean, look at a guy like I think it's next year's draft, Matvey Michkov, or it might be this year's draft. I don't know. He's projected to go in the top two. I don't know if it's with Shane Wright or Connor Bedard, but he's in one of those two drafts, right? And he's supposed to be like this amazing Alex Ovechkin level goal scorer, like the next Alex Ovechkin. He might not get the opportunity to come and play in the NHL. And it's a shame because that's one of the brightest young stars in the world, but he's not going to be able to play in the IHF tournaments. So his draft stock is probably going to take a huge hit. And our team's going to be willing to take a risk on a guy that they might not be able to get because no planes are flying into Russian airspace, and the visa and most places have canceled visas to Russian citizens. So like, it's going to be tough. And I think you're right. I think over the next so many years, we're going to see that both the amount or the quantity and the quality of draft position drop for Russian athletes. You know, a guy that might have been going in the high second round might slide all the way into the third round now just because he's got that, little red, white, and blue flag next to his name on a piece of paper.
Yeah, and the problem really is I have the IHF thing notwithstanding, NHL teams are smart enough to know that if drafting a Russian player is going to help them win, they're going to draft a Russian player, right? But it's the visibility issue because most other leagues like the SHL, the SM Liga, they have an import limit. You can only have so many players of non-Finnish / Swedish, whatever nationality, whatever league,
Per roster, yeah.
So if the visibility in the KHL is basically zero because the NHL has cut all ties with the KHL, and the NHL might not come out and say it, but I'm sure that there's a little bit of soft pressure being put on these teams saying, like, look, you can draft guys from the KHL, but let's not make a big deal about it right now. This is not something we want to do, right?
We don't want to be drawing fire for this.
And so if the visibility in the KHL basically becomes almost zero, because for NHL teams, it's not worth having a guy on their payroll who they might have to bail out of a country entirely, right?
Yeah.
Two, the quality of the KHL, like you had said, and I think is a very good point, the quality of the KHL is going to decrease with both players leaving, high-level players who maybe are fringe NHL players going overseas to play in the KHL. That's probably not going to happen for quite some time. Entire teams leaving. The quality of the KHL, so the perceived value of these stats these guys are putting up is going to be going down. They can't go out and play other in any other country. I highly doubt most teams in other countries right now are really going to accept many KHL transplants. So just from a visibility standpoint, how are we going to scout Russian players becomes an issue. And so I think that, their draft stock is going to plummet. If nothing else, it's not like the scouts are looking at it and going, oh, Russian, boo, 7th round. They're looking at it and go, oh, Russian, I have no information on this kid. And that's going to impact this year's draft. Maybe not so much this year's draft because a lot of scouting has been done, but I think next year's draft and the year after that. And then I have no doubt that once this war is over, a lot of the sports world will return to normal because that's just the way it works for the most part. But I don't think the NHL is going to be willing to really work with Russian government until Putin is gone. The IHF certainly has a very strong reason to not work with the Russian government at this point. So as long as Putin remains in power, this is going to be something that Russian hockey is going to have to deal with. And it almost feels like another curtain,
Yeah. And it's a shame because even though we're the ones throwing all the sanctions on, right? Like this is a curtain built by Putin's his own arrogance, right? Like his arrogant, stupid belief that it's still 1912 and you can go and take over a sovereign country for seemingly no reason other than the fact that you just want to,
Yeah.
So,
And it's unfortunate because Russian hockey has been one of the fastest growing in terms of skill. The Russians have always had really, really good hockey players, but it took them quite a while once they started coming over to kind of adjust to the NHL level. So obviously certain players, came over and were immediately effective. Guys like, Sergei Fedorov, Dominik Hasek, who is not Russian, but he was part of that block, right? But how long is it going to take for even after, if everything goes back to normal, how much longer after that is it going to take for us to get back to a sense of normalcy? Because here's the thing, right? Even if peace is brokered tomorrow night, as long as Vladimir Putin remains in power, there's always that risk. There's always that chance. So is the NHL really going to partner back up with the KHL to have to break that partnership again in 2 years if this happens again?
yeah. So like, what happens next time he invades like Latvia or something?
It's always that risk. And so I think that this is going to have it maybe a little bit more low key than I'm making it out to be, but longer lasting impact than I think a lot of people have on obviously the world at large, which is the more important part, but specifically in the hockey world, unfortunately, for a lot of Russian athletes, it's going to be very difficult. Specifically, the younger kids, it's going to be very, very difficult if they have dreams in the NHL. It was already difficult with the KHL, not with being locked into your KHL contract and having to have that expire before you can come play in the NHL. It's just going to be even harder now, and it's going to be very, very interesting to see how this plays out, because Russia, as one of the big hockey powers, this is going to do some damage. It really is, I think, for a significant amount of time. Because if you're a young Russian player, why are you going to play in the KHL at this point? You're not going to get scouted, So if you can manage to get out, you're probably going to take that chance,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would think so, right?
So, do you have any final thoughts or anything before we wrap this up? We're only going to keep this to this discussion because I want to isolate this. This is more important. I don't want to give this any short shrift or anything. So that's why we spent the last 50 minutes talking about it.
It's also like, how do you transition out of, talking about the consequence of war and stuff like that to more lighthearted topics like, oh, the other night, Brad Marchand fucking, I don't know, licked a guy in the face again. Like, it just doesn't work. And it feels, like you said, it would have felt disrespectful to the topic at hand.
Right.
So, if you've made it this far and you've, listened all the way through, thanks. But if this isn't your cup of tea, like, listen, we get it. Politics isn't for everybody, but this is too big to ignore. And, next week we'll be back with our regularly scheduled bullshittery that we always have. So,
Yeah. I guess we'll just wrap it up by saying, again, beating the dead horse at this point, but everyone that's ever been on this podcast, unequivocally, undoubtedly, under no uncertain circumstances, opposes this war, opposes the Russian government, opposes Vladimir Putin, and we all firmly and undeniably stand behind the people of Ukraine, and we all hope for a swift and peaceful resolution to this conflict, and for the people that started it to be held accountable in whatever way the international world at large decides to do so. And for any Russians who are listening, again, as if you're a Vladimir Putin supporter or you support the war in any way, shape, or form, and you feel implicated, you should. However, if you don't, if you're not a Putin supporter and you don't support the war, we do want to extend our kind of condolences that you now have to bear the brunt of a government decision that you had nothing to do with. So for those of you in Russia who are bearing the burden of war, who didn't have anything to do with it and don't support it, we feel for you. But just know that I think ultimately everything that we discussed today is necessary, is good, is something that's gone in the right direction in terms of all the sanctions and stuff that's been levied towards Russia. It's an unfortunate necessity at this point. We just hope that everyone can come out on the other side as unharmed as possible, except, again, for the people that started and propagate this war, who should be held accountable. With that being said, like Steve said, next week we'll be back with some more regular NHL content. But just know that this is something that continues to be something that we take seriously and we discuss basically pretty much every day amongst ourselves. It's not something that we take lightly. So I will do my best to find reputable charities to put links in the description for, if you so wish to support the people of Ukraine. And, don't go, if you think you're going to be funny and leave some kind of edgy comment, I'm just telling you right now, I'm just going to ban you. You're just going to be blacklisted from the channel. Don't do it. It's not funny, and it's not something that we joke about. So don't be that guy. You're going to catch a swift ban. So I want to thank you guys all for watching, and we will talk to you again next week.